So the general guidelines is that everything is halal until proven haram. So the first thing we mentioned is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has made intimacy through the anus clearly haram. And in fact, this is something that there's consensus on, that there's no disagreement upon, that this is prohibited. This is prohibited and is not allowed. And the same thing applies to the second one as well, that during menstruation and during postpartum bleeding, it is not permissible to have marital relations at that time. And I want to make that very clear, that a husband and wife, they can be intimate in the sense that they can hold hands, they can kiss one another, they can enjoy one another in every single way, except for having marital relations. Then number 3, we said a person should not be filthy. This general guideline means it encompasses 2 main things. Number 1 is the way that we speak with one another. So for example, living in our culture, there's this culture of, being very vulgar while having marital relations. That is not allowed in Islam. To use bad words and to curse, even when a person is having marital relations with his wife, this is not the way that they should be. But rather there's a level of humanity and a level of dignity that needs to be retained. And this is something that, is left for the non-Muslims and has nothing to do with Islam. And you'll notice that, you'll come to see this, that this is like one of the diseases of like watching, is that you start developing cultures of intimacy that are not allowed in Islam. And then you view it so many times that a person starts to think that, this is the way marital intimacy is meant to be. Related to this third point, this third principle as well, is that one should not be filthy. So you will notice that again, in Western culture, they'll use a whole bunch of products that are not, for the lack of, better words, hygienic. So those are the sort of things you have to avoid. Then the fourth thing is that you're not meant to be wasteful. And this is something that, you'll find in the books of old, that certain things that you're allowed to use in intimacy, certain things that you're not allowed to use in intimacy. So the question arises, are you allowed using food while being intimate? And the answer to this is yes, as long as you're consuming that food. So for example, I'm going to throw out names of foods, you figure out what to do with them. So when you talk about like chocolate sauce, you talk about whipped cream, you talk about, those sort of things, these are things that you're allowed to use. But at the same time, a person should not be wasteful. So those are the guidelines. Now in terms of actual intimacy itself, I want to explain the difference between intimacy between a man and a woman. From a man, if you understand what we said about him, he is very goal-oriented, whereas a woman is very experience-oriented. So for a man, it's about doing the task and finishing the task, and that is what will give him the greatest amount of pleasure, and he will be done. Whereas for a woman's perspective, it's not about completion, but rather it's about the experience itself. There will be a time a man will need to fulfill his urge, and a woman will be like, let us go out for dinner first. Let us light some candles. And the man is like, that is, on the inside, he's being, like on the outside, he's being polite, but on the inside, he's like, this is not what I need right now. I've just gone through some major fitna, something happened, and I need to fulfill my urge. A woman needs to recognize that at that time, he's not in the mood for an intimate experience, he just needs to fulfill his urge. At the same time, from a man's perspective, he cannot be greedy and selfish and think that this is the way intimacy is always going to be. There's a time to take, but there's also a time to give. But at the same time, you'll want to make sure that you're giving back to your spouse as well. And this is something that you will learn to discuss with one another. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of communicating over here. That a lot of times, a husband and wife, they'll be having problems in their intimacy, but they're like, what? It's going to stay in the dark. We're not going to discuss it. We're not going to do anything about it. We'll just continue living as it is. But a breaking point eventually comes and nothing gets solved and the relationship eventually breaks down. So it's very important that a husband and wife, so if there's something that you like, tell your spouse about it. If there's something that you dislike, tell your spouse about it. Rather than holding those feelings inside and repressing those emotions, deal with them up front, and it makes things a lot easier.